Welcome, everybody. My name is Josh Condon. I'm the resident artist and director of community music programs at Arizona Music Fest. Thrilled to welcome Dan Locklair here, composer and former collaborator, actually, with Arizona Music Fest, which we'll get into. And we're excited to welcome him for an interview wherein this year we'll be performing his Phoenix for Orchestra as part of our festival orchestra season, conducted by Maestro Bob Moody. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Josh. It's a delight to be here.
It's a delight to have you. Thanks for taking the time.
I was going to say I have wonderful memories of Arizona and at Phoenix at the premiere of this piece. It was both my wife and my first trip to Arizona, and we had always heard, of course, about bringing your sinuses to Arizona in the dry heat, and it proved to be true. It was a delightful trip and a wonderful, wonderful orchestra, and delightful people too. So we thoroughly enjoyed that trip.
Thank you. Yeah, we were thrilled to have you. And of course, the title, Phoenix Orchestra, naturally fits in with our city here. Though we are based in Scottsdale, we certainly have a lot of Phoenicians, as we call them, come to our festival orchestra program year after year. And I know for you guys, you're based in North Carolina, right?
Yes, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've been professor emeritus. I am professor emeritus and composer in residence for Wake Forest University. I retired officially from my tenured post on July 1 and was contracted on August 1 to return as an adjunct professor of composition. So I'm still teaching, but I had 43 years here, and my wife was vice president for even longer than that of Old Salem, which is one of the original settlements of the Moravians in the country, and that's one of the gems, the tourist gems of Winston-Salem. But Winston-Salem is an incredible city, 4 institutions of higher learning, including the North Carolina School of the Arts that's here, and of course Wake Forest University. So I'm a native North Carolinian, but I had spent 11 years in New York State and 2 years in the city and 9 in upstate. So coming back was a very, very important thing for me because I'm not a fan of cold winters. I had plenty of that in upstate. So I've been
That's right.
on the faculty of Wake Forest now for 44 years, and it's been a wonderful place to work and to live in Winston-Salem, which is right in the Piedmont section of North Carolina. So we have all 4 seasons, but nothing is really overly severe. So it's very close to the mountains and very close to the sea, but far enough away that we don't have those extremes like some places do.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You and I also have a connection with the upstate New York area because that's where I'm from.
I was based in Binghamton for 9 years, and I was organist choirmaster at First Presbyterian Church there, which was the largest church in town. We had an absolutely fabulous music program and had a concert series connected with it as well, bringing groups like the Waverly Consort and the Jubal Trio and individuals, Peter Marsh of the Lennox Quartet. We had so many of those there. As a matter of fact, the artist training program that Peter did attracted so many of the artists that people know now. For instance, the Peter Marsh, who was the first violinist of the Lennox Quartet, told me one day he was very concerned about one of the quartets that was studying with them. And he said, they just want to do new music. And I said, well, what's their name? And he said, oh, the Cronus Quartet. But Binghamton was a wonderful place to be, and I had finished my master's in New York City, and I was already a published composer, and I was also teaching at Hartwick College, which is in Oneonta, New York, a relatively small college but has an active music program, and I would commute up there one day a week to teach. And it became apparent to me at one point that if I was going to really teach in a university, which I did have some interest in doing, that I was going to need to finish the doctorate. So I already knew Samuel Adler, who was head of the composition program there, and so to make a long story short, I said, you know, I've got already 2 jobs that a lot of graduates would love to have. One of them a prominent organist choirmaster post, and it gave me a great deal of time to develop as a composer. And I said, I'm reluctant to give up both of those just to come back and do a doctorate. And Sam said, well, why don't you consider, coming up and living half a week in Rochester and then going back and doing the work. So I was on leave from the college for that year, and I left on that 5 a.m. Monday morning bus to Rochester. It was a 3.5-hour trip, and stayed at the 111 East Hotel up through Wednesday. Then I came back late Wednesday, did all my choral rehearsals on Thursday, and played, and then returned. I did that for a full year, and I want you to know, Josh, that was the only year where we didn't really have any snow, including in Rochester. So it was a very unusual winter, but I wound up doing my doctorate in 2 summers on either side of that, and 2 years flat. I was exhausted at the end of that, but I'd still written a great deal of music even doing that. But thanks to that Greyhound bus, I was able to do the residency year, and fortunately I didn't have any remedial work to do, so I could immediately launch into my doctoral stuff. So I have fond memories of Rochester, even though I wasn't there that much. I saw a lot of classrooms and all of that, but it's a wonderful school, Eastman, and I just value my time there.
As a composer, people often ask this, and the same is asked with conductors as well, which is, when did you decide to start composing, start conducting? Because that's not necessarily most musicians' first thought, right? They have a gateway instrument, or they have something that they start doing, and then it leads them into a particular niche in music. And so what did you have a moment that you decided to become a composer?
I don't remember the exact date. I was fortunate to have, my parents were not musical. They very much encouraged me with my passion, and there was hardly any time in growing up that I had any other thought other than becoming a musician. It was just something that was very important to me. I had a real mentor in the family. My uncle Dan Locklair was the music critic for the Charlotte Observer when I was very young, just a little kid. And Riston had been the first in the family to go away to college, and he had gone away to Chapel Hill and had an excellent education in the arts there. So he was the music critic of the Charlotte Observer, but he then decided to move to New York City and really landed some very important positions. He was writing for the Herald Tribune, music critic work with Virgil Thompson, and he was doing work for Musical America as well as Opera News. And he was just a critic, and he was a very good one. And he had no children, and he set for me a certain example of what a professional does, which is still to this day I try to answer every email or every correspondence on the day in which it comes, and Riston did that. Being a newspaper guy, he was used to deadlines. And when he moved to New York, he had been living at his mother's home, my grandmother, and his attic was filled with review copies of both books as well as recordings, because he was sent those as a critic from the Charlotte Observer to review. And I would climb up to my grandmother's attic and just play a lot of those recordings. It was the first time that I, for instance, had heard the Vaughan Williams Second Symphony. Riston had the original Adrian Bolt recording. I heard Aaron Copland's Rodeo for the first time there on an LP recording. I heard Handel, Bach, Tchaikovsky. I just heard a wide range of music from that way. And Riston would correspond back and forth to me in concerts that he would be going to, he would send. A lot of that was a little over my head at a certain period of time, but what was not over my head was a desire to learn to play the piano. So at age 6, I had piano instruction. And that was really the entree into the organ, because I had always had a keen interest in the king of instruments, the organ. And I started playing things at my home church, like chimes before the service, and the organist there became my first organ teacher. And I was also playing trombone. I was playing trombone at a level that was even higher. Eventually, I, even in high school, became a sub for the Charlotte Symphony for my trombone teacher. So I was playing a lot of music. I was playing Gabrielli as a trombonist, playing in ensembles, playing in wind ensembles, playing in orchestra, all the while developing as an organist. And my aunt claims that during all this time I was writing music. I don't have any recollection of anything before about age 14. And at that time I started to create some piano pieces, and then had a desire to create an orchestra piece, and went down to Brott Music Company, which was one of the leading music companies in the United States, really, but it was based in Charlotte. And I bought all this manuscript paper, all this 24-stave manuscript paper, and set up my copy desk and had all the pencils and all that. And I sat down, and I was setting some poems of Theodore Rethke. That was who I was going to do. There was some sort of competition that was in the encouragement for this. And I realized immediately that I knew nothing about writing for the orchestra. And that was a very important moment, because I was practicing conducting Mozart piano concertos. I was practicing conducting Beethoven symphonies. But as far as creating for orchestra, I realized that I really had a ways to go from that. Nonetheless, I was still continuing to create, and I did wind up for my high school orchestra creating an orchestra piece for the chorus, creating a chorus piece, not worth a whole lot in terms of the worth now, but in terms of my development they were. And then I began to continued to compose, and when I went to undergraduate school and started to gain those foundations of solid theory. Actually, my first theory teacher was at Davidson College, a very fine composer of the dodecaphonic leaning, David Ritchie, and I had my first theory lessons from him. But I continued to build on that, and have never not composed ever since that point.
That's fantastic. I know that being a church musician often sort of gives you an excuse to write music, right? Because you've got a built-in ensemble. Was that your gateway into real choral music, which I know you've written a ton of sacred music and certainly repertoire for the organ?
It sure was. And in college as an undergraduate, well, even from starting in junior high, I was always the accompanist of the choir. And when I landed in college, I was the accompanist for the leading choir there and the oratorio choir, so I played a lot of choral repertoire. And that's where I learned the music of Benjamin Britten, who became such an important influence. I was only able to thank him at his grave in Aldeburgh. But Benjamin Britten, like Johannes Brahms, whose piano music I was playing, so knew what to do with a small amount of musical material. Certainly Beethoven was an influence in that way too. But with Benjamin Britten, I had a special affinity, especially discovering his Festival Te Deum in E. The church is an incredible array. Some churches now, unfortunately, are not this array, but when you, during the time that I was coming up, having quality choral programs was really a mainstay for so many churches, where you could hear on any given Sunday in the home church that I was raised in, as well as the churches I served, not only the works of Bach and Handel and the whole canon of those Baroque and classical composers of Haydn and Mendelssohn of the Romantic era, but also Benjamin Britten, as well as Ned Rorem, and into the 20th century. And the plus about being in church music, which I have been in since my first professional post at age 14, the plus about being in church music is that you have to perform every week because the service happens every week. So you, as an organist, are playing new repertoire, and of course the backbone of the organ repertoire is J.S. Bach, and I don't know how it can get any better than that. But then you're also doing choral music, and even though my first position in a church was as organist only, I very quickly got to the point of developing choral skills and vocal skills and moving on to the role of organist choir master or organist and director of music. And I served a lot of different denominations during all of that time, and it was a very, very important development for me, and still is. I love the church, and I love the music of the church, the quality music of the church. So many churches have gone in another direction, but what I hold high are the ones that still maintain rich tradition of quality music.
Yeah, the church has been the repository of so much creation. And I mean, look at over the centuries, right? You know that the church has been the instigator of a ton of great music that's then been used for the concert hall or even just the texts themselves in a concert setting. So there's just a rich
Yeah.
tradition there. And I was fortunate as well to grow up as a church musician. And you're right that that weekly time to prepare and to perform, I think really helped even on a basic level, make me feel comfortable performing in front of other people. So that has, of course, stayed with me since then.
It is, and at First Presbyterian, we did 2 concerts a year with orchestra. I was fortunate, for instance, to be able to conduct Benjamin Britten's opera Noah's Flood. We did it as a whole community event. I had an outstanding choir there that could sight read about anything, and we did pieces like the Vaughan Williams Mass in G minor and Benjamin Britten works and other compositions from the 20th century. But to be able to do an opera in a church like that was just very, very special, and we had outstanding soloists for that. And of course, then we did mainstays like Messiah, which happens on Christmas, and even some of the more crowd-drawing ones where you did the audience sings Messiah. But it was a music program that was really extraordinary in so many ways, but like so many churches now, especially in the Northeast where attendance really went down. I mean, First Presbyterian merged about 6 years ago with the other main Presbyterian church in town, and fortunately they're still meeting in the Romanesque Gothic architecture of First Presbyterian Binghamton, which has a fabulous organ in it too. But it's still quite a different place than it was back in the 70s. But nonetheless, quality music within a church is not only a backbone for worship for people, but also a backbone for experiencing what is really at the heart of all of choral music, sacred choral music. And it's thrilling. There's nothing quite like it to be in a church where you can operate at that kind of high level every week. It's really quite extraordinary.
Do you have a place locally that you're either writing for or playing for?
St. Paul's Episcopal has one of these extraordinary music programs that I was talking about, and I've been very involved in there. I was actually interim organist choirmaster for about a year and a half. Since I joined Wake Forest music faculty, my main thrust has been, during that period, my composition side. I used to perform a lot in terms of concerts, touring as an organist too, but that became less and less as the composition side of my profile became more and more, because I still write with a pencil. I have to be in my studio in order to write. I don't do well writing on the road, so to speak, even though I taught 2 summers at Yale. And when I was there, I really tried, from my hotel room of writing, and I found that I could pretty much engrave things that I had done and polish things. But as far as, starting a commission from scratch and doing all, I just didn't do very well. So during the time that I've been in Winston-Salem, I had one church job that I was actually on sabbatical. And I got a little bored because I had a lot of music to write, but I still had more time since I didn't have teaching. And there was a church opening here in town that was only for the choral work, and I applied for it and got it. And and then immediately it started to haunt me when I went back to teaching why I couldn't hold down a church job. The first thing happened right after I went back after my sabbatical and had accepted this piece. Samuel Adler called me and asked me if I could head up the composition program at Eastman that summer. And I said, well, Sam, it's like this. I've just accepted another job. And I said, I don't really feel comfortable about being away for the whole summer for that, and he's understood. And then 2 weeks later, I got a call from the artistic director of the Brevard Music Center saying that he would like to name me as composer in residence for that coming summer, and I would be the youngest composer in residence that he had named. His name was Henry Janiak, who was the director there. And I just thought, this is just too much to turn down, because we're going to do so much of my music. And so I set up what I call a summer music program at this church, where we invited soloists from all over the area, and where each Sunday the organist coordinated. I set it all up. And it worked out very well, and I was able to hold on to that post for 3 more years, but it was a challenge because I had a number of requests to go. I love going to hear my music performed, especially when it's a premiere or significant performance, and I was often invited to do that. And at the same time, I didn't like having to inconvenience students or have things to make up, since I taught throughout all of my years lecture courses other than composition. That was one-on-one. And I did teach organ as well for up to about 5 students. So anyway, it meant that I had to just focus on university work and my role as a composer. But St. Paul's Episcopal, to get back to the original question, here in town is a quality music program, and that's the only place in town that I sub, and I've done a couple of funerals and weddings and things like that down there. But other than that, I keep my chops up to some degree as a performer, but if I'm going to really play a lot, I've got to have a lot of time to practice, which means that takes time out of the composition side of things. So a lot to juggle.
Yeah, I always feel there's that tension with musicians, right? Whether it's career-based, like you mentioned, whether it's fostering something that you can rely on consistently while still trying to advance at the same time, and you've got this tension there. Or as in your case, artistically, also performing and composing and keeping both chops up, right? Because that's what you have to maintain that no matter which area of music you're in, and it doesn't just happen without time and work.
Yeah, you do. Because there's a lot, to being a composer, there are a lot of things other than just simply the time you need to create the works. And I find that more each day. I get just every week hundreds of emails, and they require answers. People may be doing a piece of yours at some point and have a performance question about it. There may be more in-depth sorts of things that they want to do, and I've been fortunate to have a number of doctoral and master's students doing theses on different aspects of my catalog, and I've never neglected any of those because we often joke about the fact that so many composers are dead. And I think it's got to be some advantage to being alive, because and one of those is that you can speak with people, and if we don't speak with people about music and let our own excitement about it be known, then we do a disservice to all of music, because there's so many hurdles right now for classical music in our society. And if we don't take time to really embrace all of the people who are eager to hear what they're going to hear and hear something about it, which is exactly what you do, Josh, in terms of taking people and showing them aspects about what to expect, and people appreciate that kind of thing. So I think it's very important that we all look at those elements, and being a composer is not just a matter of going into some sort of ivory tower and just writing notes. There's a lot of communication involved, and there's just simply a lot of hard work that doesn't have quite the glamour that it does when you go out to hear a piece performed new.
You said a lot of things that I do want to tie into, one of which was using generating a lot of material from a small amount of music, which I want to tie into Phoenix as well. But you mentioned your influences beyond the great composers such as Beethoven, Brahms, Vaughan Williams, and Benjamin Britten. In terms of influences outside of music, I know you studied at Union Theological Seminary. Did you study anything besides music at the seminary?
Well, at Union Theological Seminary in New York City had one of the most renowned schools of sacred music. And there were so many people that came to the School of Sacred Music that really were musicologists and that were teaching in college posts. But it had a very high standard of admission as well as the training that went on there. And some of the true greats of church music, Alec Whiten, Robert Baker, really legendary sorts of figures taught there, just as in the Union Theological Seminary Divinity School, people like Reinhold Niebuhr and going back to so many of the other greats that came through the world of theology. But the School of Sacred Music was a very special place. It actually closed in 1973. I was a part of the last graduating class. And the school was then set up and moved to Yale, is now the Institute of Sacred Music there. So certainly theology, if you're writing works for chorus, for the church, the whole aspect of theology influences you. I had a lot of influences. I like to think that the fact that I played trombone in ensembles throughout from junior high school, and into college. I was playing professionally in college, and again, I kind of had to let the trombone slide at a certain point because I just had
Trombone slide. I see
things.
what you did there.
But the work that I did at Union as well as at Eastman was always with composition first and organ as well. So I never neglected the organ because I think it's important that a musician actually perform on something. Still regret that I was not able to continue playing trombone because there was always such a excitement about playing in an ensemble where you're really playing with other individuals. But certainly I did my share of playing for choruses as accompanying, and even as a professional church musician, I accompanied at the keyboard as my choir sang when we did unaccompanied works. In high school, or junior high school, I guess it was, I became enamored too with the Beach Boys. So I actually had a little rock combo, and it was not something that took over my love for classical music, but it certainly did let me into another whole side of music, and I've never lost my respect, incidentally, for the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson was one of the most creative figures in pop music, and sadly he just recently died. But his Good Vibrations, for instance, is a piece that uses musica concrete, which is a term that applies to electronic music and was developed for electronic music. And he used a lot of other aspects about so-called classical music in his work as a pop musician, one of which was all male. So if you think about the whole tradition of a choir that, for instance, I've written for a lot, there's the famous choir of St. Men and Boys, of Men and Boys at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue. The Beach Boys were using falsetto just as a countertenor does. And more importantly, you could understand the diction, which is one of the big issues, that if you are setting choral music, you expect to hear the words, and people who are listening expect to hear the words. And if they're not set well, they're not going to come through. And then the other thing that Wilson was also very keen on was intonation. You just simply do not hear ragged cutoffs. You don't hear problems with the pitch in what he did. I was also interested at that time in radio. I became even a ham radio operator when I was a kid and developed a love for Morse code, and had that as an influence, not a serious one that would have led me to have gone heavenly days to have gone into electrical engineering or anything of that nature, but it was still nonetheless a hobby. And the other influences were largely from the fact that I was playing in secular institutions, for want of a better word, the Charlotte Youth Symphony and my high school band and orchestra, and I was playing in a sacred institution, in a church, and I had both of those to balance, and I enjoyed both and treated them both with equal seriousness, and I do today too. I've been fortunate to have had a virtually uninterrupted string of commissions since 1982. And the plus about that is that you always know at the other end of the creative process that there is an institution or an individual that will give the world premiere of it. The negative of it is that you're always reacting or composing music that you're asked to do. So that you may very well at a certain point want to do another orchestra piece, but a chamber piece comes, or a sacred choral work comes. And I've always embraced all of that with a great deal of enthusiasm, even though there are at times pieces I would rather be writing than the ones that I'm commissioned for. But I go at them all with the same sense of seriousness and also with the same sense of purpose, which is to provide living music and to create that music with the very best possible tools that I can do as a composer. which has to do with, of course, the fundamentals of being a composer, developing craft. And that is a lifelong thing. You just don't do like the Hollywood movies do and have a theme from the Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto in the background as you're sitting at the keyboard, and all of a sudden you've just written a masterpiece. That's not the way it happens. So that's all a long-winded way of saying that there have been a lot of influences, because I think that is the whole aspect of a composer, is to be influenced by everything that is around you, the people that are around you. My parents were very special. My wife Paula and our dog Ollie are now, and they're all a part of my life and a part of the expression that I do each day as I create new work.
That's beautiful. Have you had any compositions either lately or over the years that you didn't have a commission for, that you just felt inspired that you wanted to write and maybe it found a home somewhere?
Yes, I was one that I felt very strongly about doing, which is now having a huge amount of success. As a matter of fact, it was just awarded the American prize, the Ernst Bacon Award, the national prize, is my Requiem. My Requiem is a piece that has just had an enormous amount of interest in people and been embraced. It was just performed last Sunday, as a matter of fact, in Memphis. It has a very big performance in Pasadena, California in March, where it's being programmed on the same program as the Duruflé Requiem. That piece I had known that I wanted to write for many years. I'm an only child, and I was very close to my parents, and I wanted to do a requiem in their memory. The piece was originally done. It was a very, I won't spare you with all the details, but it was one of those that was very difficult to really get to where I wanted it to be. It's challenging to do a requiem because the text can be about anything. And do you do it in English? Do you do it in Latin? What parts of the Latin Requiem Mass do you leave out? What parts do you add? And this winds up being a non-movement requiem, and I commend it to your students and to you. It has a wonderful recording from England with the Choir of Royal Holloway on Convivium, and a person can hear it even watching the score on a YouTube video, which I call Sound and Score. But the piece originally I'd had designed to be performed only with organ accompaniment, and then I decided through a lot of time in between that I would do one that was more portable for a church, not a full orchestra version, but one that was for strings and organ, which would be easy in a lot of church situations where you didn't have room to put an organ, and not an organ, to put a full orchestra. And then the even number movements of it are for soloists alone, which are accompanied by organ. And then a number of conductors said, well, we just love this piece because it's had performances in Cincinnati, Bruton Parish Church, it's just Texas, Michigan, it's just really going all over, in a big New York City premiere of it last year. But a couple of conductors mentioned that they would like to have a version that would be with orchestra that didn't have the organ component because they didn't have an organ. So earlier this year I did that. That piece was totally uncommissioned, and it was one that I felt that I just had to do. And there have been other pieces like that too in my catalog, and especially during periods where I've had sabbaticals from the university and I just simply have a project that I want to do. And in one year that I had a sabbatical, I turned down 3 different commissions in order that I could work on the one that I really wanted to do. I took some solace in that when I was reading that, which you may have already read, that Jan Swafford fabulous book on Johannes Brahms. And in that book, I learned for the first time Brahms never had a commission. He never accepted a commission. He did exactly what he wanted to do. And that's a real freedom for a composer. But the other side of it is that Brahms tended to have people who were already waiting to perform those pieces. Unlike so many of us, for instance, when we compose a piece that does not have a commission attached to it, we just wind up waiting until we can sell it, essentially, to someone, sell the idea of doing the piece to someone else, and it can be a very nerve-wracking thing. Fortunately, my Requiem, which was premiered here at St. Paul's, has had just such a wonderful reception, and a lot of that is owed to the recording that was done in England by the Royal Holloway Choir.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, this piece, Phoenix for Orchestra, that we're talking about today, was in fact a commission. And it was not too long after you had graduated from Union Theological Seminary, correct? It was for a chapel that I believe was gutted and renovated.
Yeah, exactly. Union had its James Chapel, which it had, as I recall, three different pipe organs in it. And the school, ironically, the year that the School of Sacred Music was disbanded and moved out, someone gave money for a Holt Camp organ that would replace the Moeller that was in James Chapel. And the school decided to completely gut the chapel because it had always been a very dead acoustical space. And so they rebuilt it from the ground up. And this organ was put up in the front. And I was honored to get a call in 1979. I graduated in 1973, but I started to have a lot of success compositionally, and I got a call from a very well-placed professor there. Said, we have decided we would like to commission a work from you to open the renovated James Chapel in 1980. Would you consider doing it? And I immediately said, of course I would. So, well, what we need is a 3-minute fanfare, and we have the best of the New York performing musicians here. We're going to have a brass sextet, and we're also going to have timpani, and of course the organ. And we would like to put the brass in the rear because there's not much place to put them in the front. So it was to be an antiphonal fanfare. So that was all fine and good, and I did that, and I called it Phoenix Fanfare, for the reason that you had just said, Josh, about, it had been built up from the ground up again. And after I finished the piece, it was hugely successful, very well performed, but I just thought, what do you do with a 3-minute fanfare for 6 brass instruments, and organ and percussion? I mean, just the sheer amount of money to hire those musicians to come and do a 3-minute piece. So I thought, well, what I'll do first is I'll just whittle it down. So several years after that, I just made a version of the fanfare for brass quartet and organ and percussion. And no sooner than the ink had dried on that, because we still copied in ink then, I thought, what in the world do you do with a 3-minute fanfare for just simply brass, organ, and even though it's only 4 brass instruments? So in 1985, I had already joined the faculty of Wake Forest, which I did in 1982, and at that point we had yearly convocations that were very big deals, and I thought, what if I would just simply add a processional to this fanfare? It wasn't commissioned, but I was, after all, composer in residence, and I liked the idea and was really kind of expected to contribute to the university life. So I took the fanfare as I had done it. The brass were still antiphonal, the brass quartet, and created Phoenix Fanfare and Processional for brass quartet, organ, and percussion. That piece had a lot of success, not only here. It was used for many years as a graduation piece at the Juilliard School in New York when Leonard Raver was there, who was the organist in the New York Philharmonic. And it's been performed abroad a lot and all. It was really quite popular, and it was so popular that in 1996 I got just a lot of calls from organists around the country who had heard the piece and said, would you consider doing an organ-only version of it so that we can play it without having to hire a brass ensemble? It seemed rather unlikely that the fanfare could work. I mean, if you have an antiphonal ensemble, an antiphonal brass ensemble, and you have the organ in the front and the brass in the back, how do you duplicate that in a solo organ piece? So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll just simply do the processional. And I did. The piece was then called Phoenix Processional. And that really filled a lot of the gap. Fast forward to 2006, and Bob Moody, who is just such a fabulous conductor, Bob had already come to Winston-Salem, and he had even called me right after he was named the music director of the Winston-Salem Symphony, and we had tea and coffee over at Starbucks. And he said, whenever I'm in a community, I tend to embrace a small number of composers. And he said, I've already known some of your music, and hopefully over the years that I'm here, we can do works of yours. As it turned out, he did 2 world premieres of pieces while he was here. So anyway, a couple of years had gone by since then, and in 2006, I got a call from Bob one morning. I remember it's something like 8:20 in the morning, and he said, I just heard a performance done by Jimmy Jones, who was Bob's longtime collaborator and partner in life, had just done my Phoenix Fanfare and Processional in a concert the night before in Greensboro. And he said, I just had an idea. This piece would work beautifully for orchestra if you would, and this was in Bob's words, if you'd flesh it out for orchestra. And I said, well, let me think on that, and I'll let you know. And he said, well, if you're interested, he said, I'd like to open my next season in 2007, both with the Winston-Salem Symphony and with the Arizona Music Fest. And he said, and if you were interested, I would work toward getting funding from both of those organizations. We would do a world premiere of it in Winston-Salem, and then in that same year do a second premiere of it at the Arizona Music Fest. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, this would be a wonderful thing to do. And what was born out of that was the Phoenix for Orchestra, just simply called Phoenix for Orchestra. It's exactly the same music of the Phoenix Fanfare and Processional, but I just left out the term fanfare. But what happens in the orchestra one is there's still the antiphonal component. There's still the antiphonal brass component that people hear and are thrilled about from the back that they hear. But the dialogues that would have gone on in the original fanfare between the organ and the brass are now dialogues on stage with the orchestra. And then it leads into the real crux of the piece, the very regal sort of singing melody that is a part of it, which leads into another section that is more bell-like with slightly different music, and then of course it returns to that processional sort of regal music. It was recorded commercially for a Naxos CD in 2018 by the Slovak National Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Kirk Trevor. And since then, it has been a very popular piece. And one of the real thankfulnesses that I have in life is for anyone that commissions a composition, and that piece becomes successful, which is what you always hope. It is really that group. It was, in this case, the Winston-Salem Symphony and the Arizona Music Fest that were responsible for bringing about this piece. And of course, it was Bob Moody's incredible gift of being able to hear something and imagine something else out of it, and to pick up the phone and call to me. So it's a composition that has gone through a number of different phases, as you've heard, some of it commissioned, some of it not. But in the end, it now is what it is, and it's Phoenix for Orchestra. And I'm very, very pleased that it has wound up being as it has, because I think the orchestra version really does work extremely well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when I hear it, I often thought to myself, wow, it took that long for that to coalesce into an orchestra piece, because it lends itself so naturally to that when you hear it, especially the colors, and especially as you evolve different keys. You really make use of the full symphonic palette.
Well, thank you for that, Josh. This is the thing. In some respects, it's much easier to begin a brand new piece than to take a composition that has already had its life in one particular form. And in terms of this piece, it had that connotation of being an organ piece with brass and percussion. But when you do another version of a piece, as I did with this, you have to approach it as if it's totally new to you. And that sounds strange to say, but it's really true, because I have had, throughout my career as a composer, a couple of mantras, one of which is to create music that moves me, because if it doesn't move me, how can I expect it to move someone else? And the second thing is that the music must be extraordinarily well crafted, made from the smallest amount of material that simply grows up and becomes something that is filled with integrity. And the other is that the piece must be idiomatic, so that when you write, for instance, for percussion, which I love writing for, it must be as if you are the percussionist and a natural percussionist. The viola lines, all of those need to be idiomatic. So I did sweat a little over Phoenix Phoenix for Orchestra, because it did call me to really look at the piece as if I hadn't done it before, and to reimagine it. And I appreciate your kind words about it. And if I was able to do that, then that's very important to me.
Well, getting into that idea again that you mentioned of a small amount of material, I hear some sort of Roy Harris-esque this idea of organic growth with your music, which is really fantastic, particularly in the fanfare. When you came up with the name Phoenix, how did it come to you? Is it something that you thought about? Was it the first instinct when you were thinking about what to write? How did the name inform the composition?
How to name the composition is always a challenge. I actually enjoy having a title before I begin a composition. The reason for that is that I happen to be spurred by extra musical stimulus. I have had a lot of success from just simply reading a poem, and certainly setting the poem. I always love going back to choral music. It's kind of what, and I think as we know, Schubert did much the same, of going back to writing songs, and then the lyricism of those songs was always captured in the orchestral music. But when I'm doing an abstract piece, I really like having some sort of title to be an inspiration. And inspiration, of course, is a key element in composition. It can't be the only thing, because you've got to have craft that allows that inspiration to become something of significance. But in terms of Phoenix, that word really meant a great deal to me, especially when James Chapel in New York was completely gutted down to the studs. And I thought, well, rebuilding again is really the rising of the Phoenix. And then you can't help but also tie into that, at least for me, and other people have to do what they do, but the whole idea of Phoenix in terms of resurrection, in terms of the church. There's a lot of correlation between something that is down and then pulls up. I love stories about where people have been pulled down in life and have then risen out of all of that. And I think that mythology of the word Phoenix is really behind all of that experience, where artists, for instance, are just neglected. I was seeing the piece in the Wall Street Journal today about Henri Rousseau, who is now quite heralded for his surrealism, and yet he was buried in a grave without even a marked tombstone, and was destitute. He was originally a toll collector, and decided to go into art. And it's just always sad when you see that someone hasn't risen above what they were, and in his case, he should have certainly gained that sort of phoenix in his own life, to use the word in that way. But I just found that particular term was very important, and I hope that when people hear that piece, that they will hear something in it in an abstract way. I mean, that's the thing about abstract music. It is abstract music. You're putting something in front of people like Phoenix to imagine, but that somehow in hearing that people will get the sense that this is a piece of optimism, and it's a piece that really does lift up and hopefully takes flight.
Yeah, well, that ties into its frequent use in graduation ceremonies, convocations, kind of like you mentioned. And in that music, it has to have a sense of optimism, right? These students, the people that are gathered here, there's an optimistic, bright future that this next chapter is going to bring them. And you can hear that in the music, especially with
I'm glad.
the
I'm glad
procession.
you can. And interesting you mentioned Roy Harris. No composer, I don't care who it is, cannot be influenced by what has gone before. And it's always a mystery to me, and a fascinating mystery, I might add, that composers throughout all the ages have dealt with 12 pitches. Just 12 pitches. And yet, when you hear, for instance, a note or a chord of Aaron Copland, not even knowing the piece perhaps, but you think, oh gosh, that sounds like Aaron Copland. Or you hear, for instance, a Beethoven work that starts, and you immediately know it's Beethoven, or Brahms, and yet we somehow have gone through these crazy phases where, especially in the 20th century, where people said, oh, you must be original in what you do with everything. Well, I'm here to tell you that I've lived long enough to know this, that there's nothing really original under the sun in terms of brand new discovery. You can discover new ways of putting things and uniqueness, but what you do is you can create a personality. And the personality is your own personality. And that only comes through years of work, and it comes through craft. It comes through how you use certain patterns at certain points, the habits that you do as a composer that make you what you are. That's the exciting thing. So that in a broader sense, about all of music is eclectic in the sense that it's only using 12 notes and it's using a lot of influences. Brahms would not have been what we know today had it not been for Bach, because he taught himself counterpoint. And yet when he wrote counterpoint, it sounded different from Bach. It sounded like Brahms. So my aim as a composer has always been to first not deny the fact that there are influences that come on my music, but to more importantly try my best in a gentle way to develop my own voice. And sometimes that's very difficult to hear yourself. It's kind of like looking in the mirror and saying, someone asks you to describe your own personality. You best go and find someone else to describe that. And in terms of my particular style as a composer, I know the things that I like to hear, but it's really for ones like you, Josh, who hear it to then come up with your own assessment of that. What is this style like?
Well, that's a great segue into just talking about a few specific things about this piece that really jumped out to me. And when you want to talk about craft, there's several things that is just incredible. And it's amazing how economical you are with things. So, for example, just in sort of the opening fanfare, you have this antiphonal idea, but it's not call and response in what people might think of in terms of exactly imitative. So you've got these motives that are just a few notes here, where you're essentially using within a fifth, right? But you have a descending motive, an ascending motive, and then an enclosure. When you repeat that with the organ or the other brass ensemble, depending on what version it is, right? You take the same musical ideas, but you rearrange them, right? So it's the enclosure motive, the descending one, and then the rising one. So essentially, I guess backwards from before, but not the same note. So it's not a literal backwards pitch-wise. But anyway, just small little ideas like that is you can get so much mileage out of these small changes. So it sounds interrelated, but it doesn't sound predictable. It keeps the listener really, really engaged. I don't know if that's kind of how you thought about creating those motives to then blossom into something, but immediately I just noticed the creativity that you use the small, simple ideas with.
Well, thank you for that, because I'm always honored when people notice what I spend a lot of time using as craft, or doing as craft, because you do work very hard, I do, at being able to make the most out of the least. I always have. And it's one of those things you continue to strive to do even better. And it's wonderful when a musician like you, a quality musician, can recognize these things and send back to you. It's another thing, too, that even though an amateur listener may not be able to talk about it in the same way that we as musicians are, and to recognize the pattern and a retrograde of something of that nature, it's my belief that people can hear it, even if they don't know what to describe it or to talk about it. In other words, music to me has to have something within it of integrity. It has to have something in it that stays with you. I mean, there's a very, very good reason that the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, First Movement, is probably the most recognizable classical piece in the world, because it's based on 4 notes. And those 4 notes are so skillfully used that you and I as musicians can talk about the different transpositions, about how it was, and even the second theme, how that is slightly different, but yet there's a certain parallel with what we've heard in the first. We can talk about it, but the average listener that is not really musically astute can hear it too, even though they don't know what to call it. It's something that stays with them. And that to me has been something that has really motivated my composition, is to try to say the most with the least. And in doing so, it not only provides me with a certain satisfaction to try to at least strive for the kind of excellence that we've heard, for instance, in Bach. I begin each day, for instance, playing a different Bach prelude and fugue on the organ. Usually on the piano, sometimes on the organ. But one from the Well-Tempered Clavier. It can be an invention, to simply point up how much these extraordinary composers of the past had such command of craft. It makes you feel very, very small, and it gives you something to always, on a daily basis, strive to do better. And certainly that's my mantra of making the most out of the least.
And along those same lines, not just in a small way, but in a big way, we have this incredible journey of a modulation that, you start off at A minor, right, into a key that's probably as far away from that as possible, E flat. Was that a conscious goal in your mind, or did you eventually find yourself there? I think a lot of people are always wondering, you talk about crafts, but especially for folks who are not themselves composers, there's sort of a mysterious element to it, right? Was everything pre-planned from the beginning, and then it was just sort of that dictation from inspiration? Or even if you are working it out, do you know where you're going in the end?
The easy answer to that is I don't remember. Because when you have experience and when you have craft, there are things that happen along the way that even surprise you. I like to imagine that creating a composition is creating characters in a play, to where you have characters that start and you don't really know where those characters are going to go. You have an outline, which I often will make, especially if I'm doing a large orchestra piece. I may even have parameters. I may even have key centers, for instance, where I imagine that the piece is going to grow in intensity, which means that the key level, the key notes of the piece are to rise, or something that, in other words, that is a part of a real technical plan. But in the end, what always wins out is what works. I try to adhere to a plan, but there are times where certain surprises that can come about, and all of a sudden it's a fresh new addition that you even yourself say, how did that come about? But you really don't question it, because there is in the creative process a lot of mystery to it. There's a lot that you can control, but there's a lot that you can't. But when you're given a gift, you make sure to use it.
I love that. I love that. I don't know if you're thinking in terms of modes or it was just colors, but and you mentioned characters, right? And if we kind of use that idea to get us to, transitioning keys, right? This beautiful color is disrupted all of a sudden by an unexpected note. I always tell my students that music is a perfect mix of the expected and the unexpected. So the little idea is there's just one note alteration, because you basically stay the same, and that character gets altered just slightly, and then we see the picture transform with just one little change.
I appreciate your keen ear and your keen observation, and what you have essentially said is a real important truth, which is that oftentimes things can turn on a dime in a composition. That you may have something that seems rather ordinary going along the way, and yet you turn slightly, and that turn may be salvation being a half step away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you move that half step and it changes the whole guise of it all. I would love to say that all of that just happens. It doesn't. It's as you know too, being such a fine musician yourself, that one of the aims, if you're a performer, if you're a keyboard performer, say a pianist or an organist, a French horn player, or an oboist that plays, you want what you do to appear to be effortless. Whether you tell it to yourself or not, that's essentially what you want it to be. In other words, you work every day in order to master what you do, master playing of the instrument. But when you go out on stage, you want it to appear that it's really natural for you to do it, and that whatever happens within that performance is not something that appears worked at, and certainly not studied. And I think that's the other aspect in what, picking up on what you're just pointing out, which I very much appreciate, because you're recognizing the kind of things that I sweat a lot of time over and redo and revise until I get it to the point to where I think, well, this seems right. And that's a very important observation that you've made, and it's one that has to do with, I think, quality composition. Is that you want the music to have surprise. You want it to also have a certain amount of return, which this piece does, because it goes back to that regal melody, and you want to hear that again, but you don't want it to overstay its welcome either. And that's why being a composer is one that has to do with a lot of a sense of rhythm. Not just rhythm in the piece, but rhythm in the sense of how do you make the piece. That's always a term that I've loved from poets. Poets talk about making a poem. And when you're a composer, you are essentially making a piece. And you have to be very, very careful that you don't overstay your welcome in it, and you don't understay it. It's got to be just the right proportions.
Well, in making those choices of the craft and the listener being able to identify those things without being able to name it, the way that I've thought of that idea is the inherent character of the piece. And I don't mean it in characters like we were talking about earlier, but when you're making those decisions and you're sitting down and deciding either this note or that note to get us where we need to go, but then I imagine a composer might ask the question, does this decision, does this choice fit the character of the piece in the big picture? And then that's when you say, no, this doesn't fit this. And then it's that instinct to know that, yes, this choice, this is what fits the inherent structure, the character, the proportions of the piece in a way that makes sense. And that's what the listener is hearing, is the inherent character, the nature of the work, and its internal consistency.
That's a good point. And the other side of that is that this, with composition students, and I've been fortunate to teach a large realm of composition students, or a large range of composition students, from starting many people in composition to doctoral students who would come to coach with me. And one of the things that I have found that is the most common problem among composers, not even just young composers, but a lot of the composers that have been on the scene years ago, is that they have too many ideas. And instead of taking a small amount of idea and doing something with it, they'll often, when they introduce an idea, maybe an outstanding idea, but then all of a sudden it gets dropped and you go on to something else. And what can often happen in that way is the music doesn't sound cohesive. And indeed, there are composers who have used that as a way of creating music in a different way. I think Abigail Bryan did. I think that Charles Ives, to a large extent, kind of did that, to where you disrupt that whole sense of tapestry. But I've often equated it with students that, if you're going to go to a second idea, for instance, it needs to be an idea that still is in the same house. And you can move in a house from room to room, but if you have too much difference within the musical ideas, you start to lose, or the piece loses integrity, and the people who are trying to follow it don't even know what in the world's going on. And as I say, I'm saying all these things in that a composer can purposely decide to do a piece that has a wide range of ideas, and to where it's going to be a piece that just basically falls apart in all different sections and kind of puts it back. That's a whole different thing. But I think it is important that the ideas be limited in a composition. That is, if you want to have the piece be successful. And if you don't care about that, well, that's another whole matter. But because as I've said over and over, you're being able to spot those things means a lot to me. But it also means a lot to me for someone to hear a piece of mine and to somehow be moved by it and say that there was something about it that just simply made sense to them, even if they couldn't articulate it.
Yeah, it carried them through from beginning to end, and they felt like they were on the journey with the musicians the whole time. How do you view the procession relating to the fanfare, in terms of when you had to sit down and then write this additional section? What musically did you draw inspiration from in the fanfare to then generate the procession?
Well, there is some connection, but it is complete. It is different. And that I think is dictated by even the names, the Phoenix, Fanfare, and the Processional, because the Fanfare, it talk about the challenge of, as I described in taking a piece that was already written for organ, for brass and percussion, and creating for orchestra. The other thing was of what kind of piece to add to that fanfare. And I think if you look behind the notes, you'll find that there are some commonalities in the processional to the fanfare. But that having been said, there is a real difference between the two, and I think that makes sense when you've got a fanfare that's pretty active and builds to its own climax. You really want to hear a second idea that has its own personality. The brass are really the glue that holds all of it together. The antiphonal brass, because they come back, they start the piece, and they function in the beginning of the fanfare. Then they come back at the end as a part of the transition, getting back into it. And I think that's what I thought of as being the glue for the piece. It was that element of the antiphonal writing, which is always so thrilling. Those Gabrielli, of course, championed so much of that in St. Mark's in Venice, of brass choirs and choirs of really orchestra too, multiple ones going back and forth to each other. And I felt this is a very important component of this piece. It takes 4 brass players out of the orchestra, of course, and puts them on the outside, puts them in the antiphonal thing. But it has a lot of impact into this piece sonically, but it also has an important structural aspect to the piece too.
I mean, there's many moments of magic, and that's going to be unique for each person. But for me, the magic of this piece, I think, really shines in the section and B major of the procession, because in theory you could have written the fanfare as you did, written the procession, and just sort of kept the first half of it as an enclosed thing, and then gone back to the fanfare as if it was a big ternary form. But we get this unexpected shift to B major when we could be predicting that the fanfare is going to come back, and then we get the same rhythmic idea flipped, but in a new key, but with additional percussion, and certainly with the Phoenix for orchestra, different orchestration and really fantastic use of strings. I just feel that moment really like elevates the piece and gives it the staying power in people's ears and minds.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that very much, and appreciate your again, your sharpness and being able to capture that sharpness of the B major key. Because it does. It adds a brightness. A flat, for even people who don't have absolute pitch, and I don't, but A flat can be a much more mellow, comforting key. B major has a certain sharpness to it. I mean, it is a sharp key, but by that I mean sharpness. I mean, it just has a brighter quality about it. And I felt that midsection really was served well by B.
It's an unabashed optimism, whereas you've got the regalness of the procession that's got a hopefulness, but then there's like this joy in B major that just shoots out, like the temerity of youth coming into play. There's more individuality there in the music that just shines. That's less about the pomp and circumstance. It's just so special. Thank you for writing that. So, well, if there's anything else you want to say in the piece, for the piece, in terms of either the audience that's coming to hear it or our musicians who are going to be playing it, anything you would like to say to those folks?
Well, I think first, having been out there for the Arizona premiere of that piece, I know that everything is in good hands. Bob Moody is a masterful conductor, and he knows this piece like the back of his hand. And of course, he was involved right at the roots of it, and so of course was Arizona Music Fest, as was the Winston-Salem Symphony. And there were so many audience members who we saw, who I saw after the performance, both at the reception and then at the performance, who were very moved by this piece, and that made a lot of made an impact on me. And I think that the same thing will happen this time when it's done. I just hope that people will really be moved by this composition and find something in it to really enjoy, and that will really touch their mind as well as their heart. And that's always my hope for any piece that I write, and that's certainly my hope for this one. And again, I thank you for all of your careful study of it and all that you do in the way of leading people more clearly into hearing a composition. That is very important.
Well, thank you, Dan. I too love working with Bob Moody. I'll be assistant conductor for the piece, so
I'll be
giving him all the notes and stuff in the hall, and I'm looking forward to hearing our musicians perform their work.
Wish everyone well, and the huge success of this festival, which has obviously grown a great deal since I was last out there, and what a gorgeous part of the country you have. I've only been out once, but it was absolutely memorable, and I have just such fond memories of all elements of the Arizona Music Fest, and wish you many, many more years with it.
Thank you. We'll get you a recording. All right, let's say goodbye to our friends at Arizona Music Fest, and thank you, Dan, for your time. It was an absolute pleasure. And we're looking forward to experiencing your piece coming up here soon.
Thank you, John.